George Clarence Seitz was a homicide victim whose death remained unsolved for decades before advances in forensic science allowed investigators to identify a suspect. The case illustrates how preserved evidence and modern DNA analysis can provide answers many years after a crime occurs. George Clarence Seitz was an adult resident of Pennsylvania in the early 1970s. On the night of March 18, 1973, Seitz was reported missing after he failed to return home. Family members and acquaintances initially attempted to locate him by contacting friends and checking places he was known to visit. When those efforts produced no results, authorities were notified. Several days later, Seitz's body was discovered in a wooded area outside of York County, Pennsylvania. Local law enforcement officers responded to the scene and secured the area. Investigators determined that Seitz had been the victim of homicide. According to autopsy findings, Seitz had died from injuries consistent with a violent assault. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide. Detectives from the York County District Attorney's Office and local police agencies began an investigation. Officers canvassed the surrounding area for witnesses and interviewed individuals who may have had contact with Seitz prior to his disappearance. They attempted to reconstruct the victim's final known movements and identify anyone who might have had a motive to harm him. At the time of the investigation in 1973, forensic science was far more limited than it would become decades later. Investigators collected physical evidence from the crime scene and preserved it, but the techniques available for analyzing biological material were not capable of producing the type of DNA profiles that are common in modern criminal investigations. Despite interviewing numerous witnesses and following up on potential leads, investigators were unable to identify a suspect in the case. Over time, the active investigation slowed as detectives exhausted available leads. The case remained open but unsolved, eventually becoming one of the many cold cases maintained in York County. For many years, the file remained inactive, though evidence from the original investigation was preserved by law enforcement. As forensic science evolved during the 1990s and early 2000s, investigators began revisiting cold cases where biological evidence had been retained. DNA profiling emerged as a powerful tool that could identify individuals from trace biological material. York County authorities eventually reviewed the evidence collected in the Seitz investigation. Biological material preserved from the original crime scene was submitted for forensic testing using modern DNA analysis methods. Scientists were able to generate a DNA profile from the evidence, something that had not been possible at the time of the original investigation. The resulting DNA profile was entered into the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS. CODIS is a national database maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. For a period of time, the DNA profile from the Seitz case did not produce a match in the database. However, investigators continued to monitor the system as new offender profiles were added. Cold case detectives also reviewed other aspects of the case, including witness statements and investigative notes from the 1973 inquiry. As DNA technology continued to improve, investigators used additional analytical techniques to extract more detailed genetic information from the preserved evidence. These improvements allowed forensic scientists to confirm the reliability of the DNA profile and maintain it in the national database. Decades after the original homicide, the Seitz case received renewed attention when a potential link was identified through DNA analysis. The profile obtained from the crime scene was eventually matched to an individual whose DNA had been entered into the CODIS system following a criminal conviction in another case. The match provided investigators with the first concrete suspect in the homicide of George Clarence Seitz. Detectives began reviewing the suspect's background, including his residence and activities at the time of the 1973 murder. Investigators also examined whether the suspect had any known connection to Seitz or the location where the body had been discovered. Law enforcement officials confirmed that the suspect had lived in the region during the time period when the homicide occurred. Investigators conducted additional analysis to verify the DNA match and confirmed that the evidence met the standards required for criminal prosecution. Following confirmation of the DNA results, the case was presented to prosecutors for review. Authorities determined that the evidence was sufficient to establish that the suspect was responsible for the death of George Clarence Seitz. However, investigators also discovered that the suspect had died years earlier, which meant that criminal charges could not be filed. Although prosecution was not possible due to the suspect's death, investigators announced that the DNA evidence had conclusively identified the individual responsible for the homicide. The identification allowed law enforcement to close the case from an investigative standpoint after decades without answers. Officials from the York County District Attorney's Office emphasized that the resolution of the case was made possible by the preservation of evidence from the original investigation and the advances in forensic DNA technology that occurred in the years that followed. Detectives noted that evidence collected in 1973 had been carefully maintained, allowing modern laboratories to analyze it using techniques that did not exist at the time of the investigation. Cold case investigators also pointed out that cases like the Seitz homicide demonstrate the importance of revisiting unsolved crimes as new technology becomes available. Many older investigations contain evidence that can now be analyzed with methods that were unimaginable when the cases were first opened. For the family of George Clarence Seitz, the identification of a suspect provided long-awaited answers about what had happened decades earlier. Although the passage of time prevented a trial or conviction, authorities stated that establishing the identity of the perpetrator was an important step in resolving the case. The investigation into Seitz's death involved collaboration between multiple agencies, including local law enforcement, forensic laboratories, and prosecutors. Each stage of the process, from evidence preservation to modern DNA testing, played a role in the eventual identification of the suspect. Cases like this one are often revisited as part of organized cold case review programs. Many police departments and prosecutors' offices have dedicated units that focus on re-examining unsolved homicides. These units review archived evidence, evaluate witness statements, and apply modern forensic methods to determine if new information can be developed. Advances in forensic science, including improved DNA sequencing and database comparisons, have helped resolve numerous cold cases in recent years. The identification of suspects through DNA has become one of the most effective tools available to investigators working on decades-old crimes. The homicide of George Clarence Seitz remained unsolved for many years, but the careful preservation of evidence allowed investigators to apply new technology long after the crime occurred. The eventual identification of the suspect demonstrated how developments in forensic science can bring clarity to cases that once appeared impossible to solve. Today, the death of George Clarence Seitz is no longer considered an unresolved homicide. Although no criminal trial took place, investigators have formally concluded that the case has been solved based on the DNA evidence linking the suspect to the crime. The case remains an example of the long-term value of maintaining investigative records and physical evidence. Law enforcement agencies continue to review cold cases across the United States using similar methods, seeking to provide answers in investigations that have remained open for many years. The identification of the suspect in the Seitz case reflects the broader impact of modern forensic science in criminal justice investigations. Through careful evidence preservation and continued investigative work, authorities were able to determine what happened to George Clarence Seitz more than 40 decades after his death.
Egbert Manno Stuart
was a 71-year-old resident of St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands when he was stabbed to death in his home on September 8, 2013. Stuart was a well-known local restaurateur who operated Egbert's Grill in Charlotte-Amalie. On the morning after the attack, law enforcement officers from the Virgin Islands Police Department were called to his residence in Estate West End Subbase after family members discovered his body in his bedroom. Investigators determined that Stuart had been the victim of a homicide. The medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy and concluded that he died as the result of multiple stab wounds. Evidence at the scene included blood-stained bedding and weapons consistent with a stabbing attack. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Initial investigative efforts focused on identifying individuals who had been in contact with Stuart in the days and hours before his death. Detectives interviewed family members, employees, friends, and neighbors. They also collected physical evidence, documented the crime scene, and reviewed Stuart's personal relationships and business dealings as part of an effort to identify a motive and a suspect. Although early interviews and investigative work produced information about people close to Stuart, no arrest was made immediately following the homicide. Investigators continued to pursue leads, including examining possible motives and the movements of individuals who had known Stuart. Over the ensuing months, detectives interviewed multiple persons of interest as the case remained active but unsolved. In 2014, more than a year after Stuart's death, charges were filed in connection with the homicide. Authorities charged Stuart's wife, Jennifer Jade Stuart, and her alleged lover, Gregory Green, with first-degree murder. Prosecutors alleged that both defendants participated in the fatal stabbing of Egbert Stuart in his home. Court records later indicated that prosecutors believed there was evidence linking both individuals to the crime. Charges against both defendants included first-degree murder and related counts based on the theory that they acted together to kill Stuart. Both defendants were arrested and brought before the court to answer those charges. The criminal case proceeded through the Virgin Islands court system. The jury trial for both defendants began several years after the initial arrest, reflecting the time required for pre-trial preparation and the complexity of prosecuting a homicide case with multiple defendants. Evidence presented at trial included testimony from witnesses, forensic evidence collected from the crime scene, and other material the prosecution offered to support the allegations that both Jennifer Stuart and her co-defendant were responsible for Egbert Stuart's death. At trial, the jury evaluated the evidence and testimony presented by both the prosecution and defense. In August 2022, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the facts of the case, the jury returned verdicts convicting both Jennifer Jade Stuart and Gregory Green of the murder of Egbert Manno Stuart. The jury's verdicts reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had proven the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Following the convictions, the court imposed sentences on both defendants according to the law of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Sentencing took into account the severity of the crime and the jury's finding that the defendants were criminally responsible for the stabbing death of Egbert Stuart. Each was sentenced to a term of imprisonment appropriate to first-degree murder under Virgin Islands statute. The prosecution's case reflected a theory that the defendants acted together in planning and carrying out the fatal attack in Stuart's home. The convictions brought legal closure to the investigation of Stuart's death after nearly a decade. For years before the arrests and prosecution, the St. Thomas community had followed developments in the case with interest. Egbert Stuart was a public figure in the Virgin Islands food and tourism industry, and his death drew significant local media coverage. Family members and business associates had expressed a desire for justice after his killing, and the eventual convictions were significant developments in achieving accountability. The case also illustrated aspects of homicide investigation and prosecution in the U.S. Virgin Islands, involving the collaboration of local law enforcement, prosecutors, and the criminal justice system. Evidence collection, forensic analysis, interviews, and courtroom proceedings were central components of the nearly 9-year journey from the homicide to convictions. The conviction of the defendants did not erase the impact of Stuart's death on his family, friends, and community. However, it established a legal finding that the individuals responsible for his death had been identified, tried, and found guilty by a jury. The resolution of the case is documented in court records and reported in local media, providing a factual account of how the matter was resolved through the criminal justice system. Egbert Manno Stuart was remembered by some in the Virgin Islands community as a restaurateur and local businessman. His death and the subsequent prosecution of those convicted in connection with his murder are part of the public record concerning violent crime and justice in the territory.